everybody. Welcome to It's Not Scary, It's Just Music. It's me, SJ. Hey, welcome to 1999. We're at the very end of the decade. And this is the last chance for the 90s to really show us what it can do. It's already shown us quite a lot so far. I'm amazed at the amount of hit albums that we've gone through this season, this decade, year by year, to arrive at this moment. It actually makes me very excited to do the recap as our season finale because there's just so much to talk about as far as where we started in 1990 up until this year. And I promise very much so that I will do what I can to make it as short as possible, but I cannot promise anything. So I'm most excited to talk about this year in particular just because we're at the end of the 80s. So in 1988, 89, I perceived that we were starting to move aggressively away from what had been happening over the previous several years in the 80s and moving towards the huge amount of inspiration that was just over the next ridge for the 90s. But for the 90s, I perceive that we've hit a lot of those critical milestones already, and I don't perceive necessarily that we are going to be rejecting anything from the 90s going forward into the 2000s with as much gusto as the music community did between the 80s and the 90s. As a result, I seem to recall that we're going to very steadily move into new trends as we go along. There's not going to be nearly as many hard right turns for the remainder of our time going up until current day like we experienced in the 90s. I could be wrong. I could be misremembering. So in that regard, I'm excited for us to go on that journey and find out. Specifically for 1999, though, I do perceive that we're doing a heavy amount of experimentation across genres where I think that earlier in the decade, there was a lot more confidence and certainty around some of these sounds and ideas. Even if we were jumping from one idea to the next idea, it was all essentially happening with significant confidence. And in this year, I'm not perceiving that to be nearly the case. I think that we're stabbing in the dark a lot with a high degree of experimentation and trying to sort some new ideas out. But that's okay, because if we're experimenting, we don't need to be confident in exactly what we're doing right now necessarily, but more confident that we will find an appropriate landing zone at the end of this micro journey to get to the next idea, the next sound, the next trend. And I think there is confidence that we will get somewhere meaningful soon. So before we get into today's episode, I just want to remind that if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I reference in today's episode, be it through my essential tracks or the rest of those albums, or my conspicuous absences for this year, or any other albums that I decided to keep for 1999, you could check out my essential playlist and my big list, which are on Spotify, that are linked in the description of today's episode. So, what are we going to talk about today? As usual, we're going to talk about what's happening right now in 1999 in the world of music. Next, we're going to talk about my essential albums for this year and why, and then finally, my conspicuous absences from my essential list and why. So, what's happening right now? To start, as always, with rap. Empire rap is continuing to happen. It's going to continue to happen well beyond this decade and the next decade. Eventually, though, as a trend, it will start to lose some steam, lose some power, and maybe change shapes in order to retain some degree of relevance. But for right now, it's very much what's happening in the world of rap. Additionally, what I talked about last year with story rap officially finds some degree of certainty and a milestone this year with a particular album. We'll talk about it when we get to our essentials. And hopefully by doing that, we might be able to reveal a little bit more about what story rap is or could be, or even whether or not story rap is the appropriate name for this trend, or there's a better way to define it. And then further on the retro side, the neo-golden era of rap and also retro MCing are officially in full swing. We've got a couple examples in which those two retro ideas are being utilized for current rap trends and being merged together. So we'll talk about that more in the essentials. And then finally, retro turntablism. So not necessarily second wave turntablism or neo turntablism, but actual retro turntablism ideas, much like the neo golden era and the retro MCing, also finding some footing in 1999 too. So the three major milestones and markers of the golden era, be it MCing, the era itself and what they talk about, and also the turntablism artifact, all three of them are finding a retro foothold in the music of 1999. On the folk side, it's, as has been happening this entire decade, continuing to merge and integrate with indie pop. There's also a few more infusions this year with other genres that we'll also talk about when we get to them. But just know that folk is certainly standing on its own in a variety of capacities across artists. So it's not like the pure form of folk isn't happening, it is also happening. But as far as it being relevant to current music trends, it's mostly getting integrated into other things as has been happening. And there's just more integrations with other subgenres that continues to happen in 1999. On the reggae side, nothing really noteworthy this year to talk about. I'm sure that as we progress forward, there will be another iteration or another evolution or wave of reggae. Reggaeton will continue to happen and exist and evolve. So when we experience new things to bubble up, we'll talk about them. But for 1999, nothing really to talk about. On the electronica side, the jazz electronica that was being ushered in by Square Pusher is continuing to emerge in the electronica space. So you can just presume that that's continuing to happen. I don't think we have any examples on the essentials, but just know in your mind that that is continuing to progress and happen. EDM and what I'm calling second wave house are continuing to progress as well. So we started with this new iteration of what I called just EDM or techno pop in 1997 with Homework by Daft Punk. We're taking it one step forward this year, and I'm officially declaring this as being second wave house versus just being EDM. So again, we'll talk about it in greater detail when we get to that example in our essentials, but just know that whatever was happening on the Homework by Daft Punk side, we're officially taking those ideas and leaping forward into a whole new thing and not just calling it electronic dance music. The drum and bass movement continues to wane, so not strictly just being jazz electronica, but the entirety of drum and bass at this point has been around for 5, 6 years, 7 years maybe at this point, that it is starting to officially wane in favor of other ideas. Second wave house is going to lean forward to fill that void a little bit and more experimental electronica as we keep going down this journey of the jazz electronica idea. We're going to keep finding new and different things, and then indie electronica continues to be relevant and grow. We're definitely not done with that yet. That's much more in the mix. And then on the retro infusion side, neo-synth is starting to emerge as well. So the synth pop electronica ideas that were happening in 79, 80. So if you want to think back to our very first episode talking about the Yellow Magic Orchestra, ideas like that are starting to find their way back to us now, which if you might remember from that episode, if you listen to it, that they were influenced off of artists like Kraftwerk. So Kraftwerk was happening in the mid 70s and going into the 80s. We didn't really talk about them very much, but all of that was influential in bringing us to artists like Yellow Magic Orchestra. So all of those ideas are starting to find their way back into the zeitgeist and integrating those retro ideas into all these other current things that we've been talking about here over the last minute or so. So just keeping that in mind, that retro movement is moving in. On the rock side, indie rock still rules everything and will continue to rule everything for at least another few years. Fourth wave alt rock is continuing to be, I would say, second place. I'm starting to notice too in the fourth wave alt rock movement that we're moving towards garage rock. And when we think about garage rock, think White Stripes. White Stripes is going to be happening fairly soon. So it's interesting to me that where third wave alt rock was ushering in indie rock, fourth wave alt rock is going to be ushering in garage rock. And so that makes me curious that once garage rock officially declares itself, is there going to be a fifth wave of alt rock that's going to move us into another major offshoot genre of rock music? Maybe. I don't know. I don't remember. I'm excited for us to go on that journey. As well, shoegaze, slowcore, sadcore, the second wave of all three of those is continuing to happen. All three are continuing to be integrated into either indie rock, alt rock, or some other genre to add some additional flavor to it. But just know that those isolated in their purest form are also continuing to happen. I'm not 100% sure if we reference any that are pure second wave shoegaze, slowcore, sadcore this year, but it is definitely happening, and we'll talk about it at length when we get to our essentials. Also, neo-arena rock is starting to find its way into current music. So we've been talking for several years, in particular about Royal Trucks, how hair metal and 70s and early 80s metal, heavy metal have been finding their way back into the alt-rock scene and integrating there and creating new, different, interesting ideas. And now arena rock, which you can think of as, for example, AC/DC, when we talked about Back in Black in 1980, that was arena rock. So thinking about taking those retro arena rock ideas and bringing them forward and figuring out, maybe we're not necessarily playing in the arena, but we're playing with those AC/DC-esque styles. And how do we merge those with alt rock of today or indie rock of today? Great question. In our essentials, we'll talk more about it so we can uncover that fusion. Also, second wave neo Brit rock is moving in. So neo Brit rock a la Oasis, we're going into a whole new wave beyond them. So taking those ideas and moving them further forward. So that's happening too. And then finally, neo psychedelic rock is starting to wane a little bit in favor of other ideas. I think we're more experiencing neo psychedelic pop, much more so than neo psychedelic rock. But let's be honest, neo psychedelic rock in all of its shapes and forms has been going for almost 15 years at this point to capstone with OK Computer. I think it's okay if we give it a break. And hopefully it is going to be getting a break in its current form and letting it rest for 18 to 20 years so that we can revisit it when it becomes yet another retro movement. I'd like to believe that will happen, but I guess we'll find out when we get there. On the metal side, beyond what I just talked about regarding hair metal, retro hair metal, 70s, 80s, heavy metal, arena rock, and everything in that metal space, which is, as I said, continuing to happen. This year, we also have, not on our essentials, but on our big list, one example of neoclassical metal, which I think is the official term for it, but you can think of it more as like neo heavy metal. Think about Black Sabbath from 1980 or Dio, Ronnie James Dio. So when Ronnie James Dio was part of Black Sabbath, I think we referenced Neon Nights during the recap from the 1980s. So think about that style of heavy metal. So taking those ideas and just in an 80% capacity playing those same ideas for today, I think at least at this early moment of bringing those ideas back, they're still much more retro than they are neo. But the movement itself is called neoclassical metal. It's the same way that in 1989 with Widespread Panic, and maybe at the very beginning of the 90s with 10 by Pearl Jam, it was retro roots rock, and eventually they figured out a way to make it neo roots rock. We're in that moment again, except with heavy metal. So just think about it that way. And then beyond that, alt metals continue to happen. Korn, great example. We have an essential this year that we'll talk about it in greater detail. And then along the alt metal slant, emo metal is also emerging at the same time. They're running parallel to each other and complementing and feeding off of one another very well. So alt metal, emo metal, both are happening at once. So finally, metal's starting to find its footing again, which is really exciting because it's been quiet for almost this whole decade. And that also says to me, too, that grunge must be really moving its way out if there's space for the pure metal scene to reaccumulate the metal identity for that subculture within the greater music community, that grunge doesn't have that stranglehold anymore. So grunge must really, really be on the way out if it's giving space for metal to flourish once again on its own. On the punk side, second wave pop punk starts this year. So interestingly enough, it's an evolution off of Blink-182 and not necessarily Green Day. So it's an evolution off of Blink-182 on the way eventually towards Fall Out Boy, which will happen a few years from now, but we're on the journey to get to that point. So second wave pop punk is that in-between period between Blink-182 and Fall Out Boy. As well, post-punk is coming this year, and there's not really a better way for me to call it other than calling it poster punk, but it's just the next iteration of post-punk. So the reason that I'm calling it post-punk and not something else is because it's very obviously taking post-punk conventions, think about Dead Kennedys, for example, and bringing that forward into a whole new idea, whole new iteration, using it in totally different ways in order to elicit the same ideas. Interestingly enough, I do think it is evolving out of Riot Grrrl, but we didn't really regard it in that moment because it wasn't so starkly obvious that it was a post-punk reference. And it was a little bit, and I think we might have even talked about it when we talked about Call the Doctor or Dig Me Out when we were discussing Slater-Kinney. But it's just so clearly obvious now that post-punk is turning into its own thing, so calling it out. On the country side, third wave neo-traditionalist country continues to happen. The Chicks are driving that forward. They drove it forward last year. They're driving it forward this year. So that sound will probably continue for the next year or two before things start to take an interesting turn post 9/11. But it's the sound of country for right now, at least. On the R&B side, nothing noteworthy to talk about this year necessarily. It's kind of a shame. I was really excited about where R&B was going coming out of the end of the 80s to capstone what was happening over the whole saga that was the 80s R&B scene. And unfortunately for R&B for 1999, it's pretty quiet. So there's not a lot to talk about here, unfortunately. On the pop side, indie pop, second wave dream pop. So second wave dream pop doesn't have any examples this year, which says to me maybe that we're starting to wane a little bit on dream pop, which is good. That's nice. It means that things are changing and evolving. Indie pop is much more taking a hold. Neo-psychedelic pop is finding more of a foothold, which means that maybe they're moving in and pushing some stuff out. Neo-folk pop continues to move forward. And then also taking old ideas, like we were saying in the electronica section a second ago, more synth pop. So we're bringing forward retro synth pop ideas into current indie pop conceptions. I'm not necessarily calling it neo synth pop just yet, but we're getting really close. And then finally, what I'm calling newer wave. So it's not new wave, but it's newer wave. It's taking new wave ideas and it's mobilizing them with indie pop conceptions. So I'm calling it newer wave because I think calling it new wave would be silly. Kind of like post-punk. It's just newer wave. If there's a better definition, leave a comment and let me know about post-punk or newer wave, and I'll take it. On the avant-garde side, we're mostly just living in the electronica, folk, pop, rock spaces right now and just continuing to push envelopes there. You could just always presume that avant-garde is pushing the envelope in every respect for the most part, where it's finding quality. On the video game music side, the decline continues, unfortunately. There is a really wonderful album that is in our essential albums this year to thankfully capstone the entire decade to give you really a strong bookend on where we started and where we're going to end up. It really does paint a very beautiful picture, so I'm very happy for us to talk about it this year. But the genre as a whole is declining nonetheless, very much so. On the J-pop side, third wave J-pop continues. There's more people than Nao Mazazaki that's bringing forward quality here, which is great to see. Avant J-pop via Miho Asahi is continuing as well. And then also this year, first wave dance J-pop bubbles up for the first time, even though it's been around for a few years already. If you dig into my big list, going back to 98, 97, 96 maybe, you could find potentially more dance J-pop of this first wave if you look hard enough, but it's continuing to bubble and there's more artists that are coming out with more dance J-pop. And this year we have probably the most popular J-pop album that came out in the entirety of the 90s. And we'll talk about that when we get there in our essentials. And then finally, K-pop. It's quiet to end the decade, kind of like R&B, and I'm sad about it, unfortunately. I kept trying and I kept looking for high quality K-pop albums to really round out. And Sotaji and Boys, that first album was just it. I'm absolutely certain that when we get to 2000, 2001, suddenly there's going to be a lot of K-pop for us to talk about. But unfortunately, to end the decade, K-pop ends quietly. So next, let's talk about our essential albums for 1999 and why. First is American Football by American Football. This is retro new wave, so not newer wave, but retro new wave, indie rock, and what I'm calling neo alternative rock, which is basically taking the first wave of alt rock, so REM, Husker Du, and updating it and making it new and fresh again. I don't think it's necessarily a new wave of alternative rock because it's not evolving out of what Royal Trux is doing, for example, going in the direction of garage or something else. And it's also not strictly retro REM. It's a little bit new, it's a little bit indie, it's a little bit different. So that's why I'm calling it neo alt rock. The two tracks I'll give you, both of which are wonderful, are Never Meant and The Summer Ends. So I do often go in order alphabetically by artist. But of all of the different artists that are doing new wave this year, this was the clearest early sign that new wave was being accessed again in a retro sort of way. What do I mean by that? Listening to Never Meant or The Summer Ends, but mostly Never Meant, really sounds like The Police. So staying in The Police. Zenyatta Mondatta specifically. If you are interested in listening to those two tracks, Never Meant and The Summer Ends, and then going back and listening to the tracks I referenced on Zenyatta Mondatta, they have very similar alignment to them. And the timing works out pretty well because Zenyatta Mondatta came out in 1980. So 19 years. It's right in the pocket of that 18 to 20 year rule. So they are firmly right in the middle of referencing those ideas and bringing them forward. This is pretty classic retro mobilization to infuse new ideas into what's currently happening. As I said, this is a really wonderful album. It's very well crafted. It does have some slowcore, sadcore, shoegaze components to it. but mostly it's mobilized through indie rock, so that's kind of why I'm calling it just straight ahead indie rock. It is much more melodic like REM is, which is why it's got that neo alt rock thing going on. It's just really interesting. It's a fun, adventurous album that when I was first going through and building out the list for this episode, I was tepid on it. But as I've sat down and I've listened to the album more and more to pick out the songs that I was interested in highlighting, it's really grown on me. And I do find it, as a result, to be one of my favorite albums for this year. It's just very pleasant, very pleasing to listen to, and it's very introspective and calming and soothing. If you like these two tracks, I picked these two because they were the most representative of what I was talking about around retro new wave and neo alt rock. But the rest of the album is about this tone. So if you like what's going on here, give more of the album a listen because it is very pleasant and pleasing to listen to. And their perspective is very strong and confident for indie rock. It's also a really great juxtaposition to what was happening last year with Death Cab for Cutie. It feels like we're evolving even a little bit beyond that already, and it's only been just a year. So very exciting. It's a pleasing listen, so give it your time. So next is Ayumi Hamasaki, Love Appears. This is dance J-pop, and as I said a minute ago, is the most popular J-pop album of the entire decade of the 1990s, period. This was an earth-shattering J-pop record that changed the face of J-pop going forward. I call it dance J-pop and not some wave of J-pop because it is very much different than what third wave J-pop is, what second wave J-pop was, what the original J-pop was when it was still city pop. This is much more dance focused. The beats are really fast. It makes you feel like you want to dance. It does have J-pop components to it and artifacts. Like you listen to the tracks I'll give you, Fly High, Trauma, and Who. All three of those really highlight all of the little J-pop artifacts that you may very well have been hearing as we've been navigating through the J-pop journey over the last 2 decades. IU brings that forward very effectively, and the dance component also very effective. My understanding about IU, or Ayumi Hamasaki, is that she writes most of her stuff. So there's a little bit of a Madonna-esque component to it. I also think that her voice is shaky. It's not the strongest voice that you'll hear across all of the J-pop music, or even pop music in general. So I think that she does do a good job eliciting the emotions in her voice. She obviously can get the listener / the crowd pumped up, so she is a great J-pop idol in that regard. Dance J-pop has been around for a little bit already, but this is the first time that it's at least of a high enough quality that we can spotlight it justifiably on the essential list. There's a couple other things that I want to talk about regarding this. First of which is, I'm just going to qualify and warn you that if you're just listening to the essential tracks one after another and not really thinking about how you're moving from one artist to another, The Summer Ends by American Football is drastically different than Fly High by IU. So just get ready for that because I don't want to startle you as you go from The Summer Ends, which is quite contemplative and just very elongated, and Fly High is dance J-pop. It's kind of a whiplash, so I'm just letting you know. The other thing that I'll tell you about this record, because it is Ayumi Hamasaki's debut record, is that much like Britney Spears coming out with her record, this was a milestone moment in the directionality of pop music, at least for Japan, where in Britney Spears' case, on her cover comes across as schoolgirl, very virginal, and that's the vibe that she's exuding. And then as she goes along with successive tracks, successive albums, she becomes a little bit more of the provocative icon that she eventually becomes. The thing about Ayumi Hamasaki in her first shot right out of the gate is that if you look at the album cover, she is presenting herself in a provocative way immediately, which is a huge juxtaposition to all previous J-pop idols that have come before her, that maybe they hint a little bit at being provocative, maybe, but for the most part, they are hyper virginal, hyper pure, hyper childlike in how the pictures are taken, how they present themselves, or how they've been dressed or positioned. This is just her confidently standing full face in the camera and presenting herself in a provocative way. And that is such a huge cultural leap for the Japanese pop idol idea that I'm sure that at the time was earth-shattering, because suddenly declaring herself at the top of J-popdom and also presenting herself in that way, that's how it changed the face of J-pop forever. that she is saying we don't all have to present ourselves as pure, untouched, uncertain flowers that sing about banal topics that are inoffensive, unchallenging, and don't elicit any meaningful emotions in our audiences other than, look at me, I'm so cute. Ayumi Yamasaki is going in a totally different direction from a purely empowerment standpoint, saying, I'm here, I'm a woman, I am an artist, I am provocative, I have a very particularly confident position to take, and my music is not always just about sunshine, rainbows, and homework. It's about complex emotions. Now, granted, it's dance J-pop, so it's not going to go too deep into those realms. Like, we're not talking about J alternative rock here or something. But it does challenge you a lot more than it did when you were listening to even Henri from 15 years ago at this point. She's more challenging than that. So because of that, it's provocative and it changes the conversation considerably around J-pop henceforth. So if you like these 3 tracks, like I said, her voice is not stellar. I'll give you that right out of the gate. Listen to Fly High and you go, ooh, she's missing a couple of those notes. It is what it is. But when we do the recap, we'll probably talk about Britney Spears, and she's not the most stellar singer either, but critically important to the history of pop music nonetheless. And so if you like these 2 tracks and where they're going, it does fluctuate a little bit in terms of how much dance J-pop it is and how much traditional J-pop it is. So explore another track and another. These are 3 of the 5 probably most popular tracks from this record. So considering that it's the most popular J-pop record for the entire decade, you can give it a little bit of your time. Give it a chance. See how you feel about it. It's got some fun pop hooks to it, so I wouldn't dismiss it. So next is Basement Jaxx's Remedy. This is electronic dance music, but also second wave house, like I was talking about at the beginning of the episode. The 3 tracks I'll give you: Rendezvous, Jump and Shout, and Red Alert. This is very clearly evolving off of Homework by Daft Punk. They are making it even more dancey than they were previously. So where you could use Homework by Daft Punk in the club to dance to, maybe, potentially, this is just taking that in even more dancey directions. And as a result, I'm officially declaring us in a totally new, different place, even if it just feels like it was a half step further than where Homework took us. Interestingly enough, I think that when we get to Daft Punk's next popular album, it's going to sound a lot more like this, maybe even evolved off of this a bit more, but it's not going to sound nearly as repetitive as Homework was. It's very clear that Basement Jaxx and all other artists that were playing with these ideas at the same time that maybe we're not aware of, were pushing that envelope off of where Daft Punk was initially taking us and just carrying it even further forward, because it's clear that there's a lot of inspiration happening in this space right now, and a lot of these electronic artists are just riding the wave to wherever this is going to take them. If you like these 3 tracks, the rest is about as dancey as this, so if you're really hitting the vibe with like Rendezvous, for example, keep going. It's a great album. Remedy is pretty classic around this era of electronic dance music / house music, so give it your time. It's really fun. So next is Ben Christopher's My Beautiful Demon. This is neo-psychedelic rock, mostly. I think there's probably some indie components, maybe some folk components, but it's predominantly neo-psychedelic rock. The tracks I'll give you, there's only 2 of them, My Beautiful Demon and Give Me Everything. So what's intriguing about this album is that although it's just him, and I perceive that the artistry, the complexity has been turned down a little bit from OK Computer, it's clear that Ben Christophers is trying to mobilize further than where OK Computer took us, which is interesting to me because at least what I know about Radiohead is that from here we're going to Kid A, which is a drastically different idea than what OK Computer was. And so artists like Ben Christopher is saying, yeah, we could take even what you did, which was an absolute triumph, and maybe inch it forward another few steps down this neo-psychedelic rock train. Just says to me that Radiohead might have been, as a result, comfortable with moving away from the genius that was OK Computer to the next bit of genius to come. So it's an intriguing micro-evolution that you should be able to detect some of those pieces and parts off of OK Computer and where this is taking us in neo-psychedelic rock. You also should be able to detect that My Beautiful Demon and Give Me Everything, being a good representation of My Beautiful Demon, the album as a whole, is that neo-psychedelic rock is starting to level off and start to descend a little bit in terms of its peak of creativity. I think that a lot of the markers of this album are pretty set in stone at this point, and it's giving us just a really great example of the genre in its purest form. So maybe the pushing is starting to lighten up a little bit and we're just settling into whatever neo-psychedelic rock is going to be going forward. It's possible that we might have a second wave of neo-psychedelic rock. Like I said, we've been talking about it for about 15 years at this point. So maybe from here, we're going to either stop talking about neo-psychedelic rock or there's going to be a second wave that emerges that allows us to pivot hard and go right into wherever this takes us next. Like I said, these 2 tracks should be a good representation of the album as a whole, so if you like them, keep going. It is also quiet and contemplative, a little bit like American Football is, but this is more just a neo-psychedelic rock flavor to it. So if you like it, maybe give it another track and another and see if you're still hanging in with it. And if maybe you're not tracking with the rest of it, that's fine. Or if this is your vibe, keep going. It's a great album. Ben Christopher's. He had some really great ideas on how to take OK Computer to the next level. So really appreciate it. So next is Eminem, the Slim Shady LP. This is story rap, I guess. I don't really know what else to call it. Story rap. The 3 tracks I'll give you, which should be pretty obvious to almost anybody that's ever listened to this album. My Name Is, Guilty Conscience, and Role Model. Like I said, I don't know what to call this but story rap because Eminem does such an amazing job of telling his story or telling the story of other people's stories so well. It's amazing to witness. And concurrently, the clarity of his lyrics, when you compare up to some of the alt rap that we've been listening to, some of the underground rap, some of the gangster rap, comparatively, it's almost impossible to understand what those artists are saying because you can so very clearly understand what Eminem is saying. I have always perceived that a rapper that has the ability to tell a very clear, coherent story, and you can very clearly understand the articulation in their words, will always be a winner for me. Even if the story makes no sense or it's total garbage or the backbeats are totally uninspired, if I can understand what you're saying and understand what you're talking about without 15 degrees of metaphors and mystery and complexity to what you're saying, like I love Kendrick Lamar endlessly, not because of how deep and complex his lyrics are, but because I can understand what he's saying. And that might just be my limitation as a rap listener. It's also possible that maybe the artistry and the poetry of rap to a certain depth is lost on me, and that's again my limitation. But if nothing else, for me, anytime I can understand what you're saying and really picture in my mind where you're trying to take this lyric or this bar or the entire song as a whole, it's going to be a winner for me. And Eminem is one of the absolute best at doing that. I think we haven't had somebody that is this clear cut since Ice Cube. And this is to say too that Biggie and Tupac, also very excellent. I don't think that they were as clear in their lyrics as Ice Cube was. Ice Cube could paint an amazing picture, and so can Eminem. And I'd like to believe that Dre, personally partnering up with Eminem for this entire album, shows that he also perceives that Eminem is somebody special that can tell a very clear, coherent story, and there is no way that you will not be able to understand every single word that he's saying. And everything that he is saying is hilarious and irreverent and deep and dark and scary in its own way, because Eminem's life up until this moment was pretty scary. But in that regard too, it's not gangster rap, because Eminem is not talking about being a gangsta at all. He's talking about being poor. He's talking about having a broken family dynamic. He's talking about not believing in himself and then maybe believing in himself a little bit. He talks about the complexities of making decisions in unknowable or difficult situations. He talks a lot about, in Role Model, how he should not be a role model for anybody. And to me, that goes back to Ice Cube, where he was mostly talking about either his life or doing such a good job painting a fantasy of his life that you really understood the Ice Cube persona. I think Eminem is doing that flawlessly. So because of that, I'm calling it story rap. I'm happy to call it something else, but this is distinctly different than gangster rap or alt rap or underground rap or any of that other stuff. And it's also not G-Funk, because there's no G-Funk components to this. Dre seems to have completely walked away from G-Funk at this point. So it's a very interesting album. You may or may not know that this is an amazing album just based upon the fact that this is Eminem and this is his first major album. But in case you haven't listened to it for a minute, give it your time. Eminem is a genius. He's a genius lyricist, and he paints a picture like almost no other. So give him your time. So next is Korn, with a K again, and the album is Issues. This is alt metal and also emo metal. It's doing both at the same time, almost concurrently on top of each other. The tracks I'll give you, which were very hard to decide on because there's so many, not just hits on this album, but so many amazing tracks on this album. Falling Away From Me, which is a gargantuan hit for them. Beg For Me, huge hit. Make Me Bad, big hit. And Somebody Someone, which is another reasonably large hit for them. So first, before we get into the album itself, I just want to honor the fact that Korn, since 1994, when we talked about them last, so 5 years, has evolved and refined and honed their ideas and their sound and their vision so well. They've done such an amazing job to go from Korn, which sounded much more like grunge thrash metal / maybe alt metal at that time, to what this is. This sounds so professional. This sounds so clear in their perspective. I think it's a beautiful thing. And as one music file in the world, I'm so proud of how far they've come as an artist to strip away everything that didn't serve them and just focus on the vision that they knew existed in whatever these ideas were. They've found it. So kudos to them. Beyond that, I want to talk a little bit about this album. Because as we've been going through this podcast, and I'm saying it's not scary, it's just music. So putting that aside and talking about the album itself, over the course of these 2 seasons that we've been doing, what have I been saying this entire time? It's not scary, it's just music, right? And in a similar vein, it's not sad, it's just music. But I will tell you flat out that when I was listening to this album, it made me very sad. And I'll tell you why. So assuming that this is art, and in art it is talking about people with issues, just like the album is called, that whoever this art is for makes me very sad. Because I would like to believe that Korn was telling many stories about somebody who has issues of some kind. And in some cases, it could be the same person that has all of these different issues that are one ball of issues that exists within one or more people. And in that regard, I'd like to believe that if you were at an art gallery and you were looking at somebody's painting, and that painting portrayed somebody who was deep in melancholy or was in a place of deep despair, that you would be hopefully astounded at the artist's ability to paint such a clear example of someone's melancholy and despair and rage and everything, right? And I'd like to believe from a pure artist perspective that this is what they were doing. Because I think as a person, it would make me even more profoundly sad if somehow the entire band that is Korn, one or more of them who are writing these songs, feels all of these different ways or feels like that's what's inside them legitimately, and they're putting that out there to connect these ideas with other people. That would make me even more sad. I really hope that what these songs represent is just a hypothetical or theoretical person that has issues as if it were a case study. So there's that. The other thing that makes me profoundly sad is whoever listens to this music and identifies with the topics in this music in a non-thoughtful consumer, but more so they are speaking my language and this is who I am as a person, that makes me very, very, very sad. Because each one of these tracks that I give you, so Falling Away From Me, Beg For Me, Make Me Bad, and Somebody Someone, paints a very cynical, sad, desperate, rage-filled, depressed person that has issues on top of issues. And it's not necessarily a judgment, but more just to say, I wish that whoever these people were that are being sung about, or the people that listen to Issues by Korn and say, yeah, this is what I'm all about, I want to give them a hug because they're very, very sad topics. Talking about how the subject of a song and Falling Away From Me, it's people that are leaving them, people that are falling out of love with them, that are disconnecting from them, and the person starting to feel very isolated in their life when they are in their most vulnerable and isolated moment, feeling at their lowest point, in their greatest amount of despair. The people that are closest to them are falling away from them. How sad is that? Or Beg For Me. The idea that I don't love myself enough to have a healthy mutual relationship with somebody. Someone has to beg me to be with them so that I can wield some degree of power over them so that I can fill some hole inside of me that power will definitely not fill. it will only be by creating a mutual connection, and that this person in this song that has issues, that's their angle that they're taking, that you need to beg me to be with you meaningfully because that's the only way that it makes sense for me, is so sad. Or make me bad, a person that is legitimately trying to have a good life and trying to build good, positive, healthy relationships with people and gets connected to somebody that they want to create negative and unhealthy dynamics with because they feel that that's what they deserve. Undeniably sad. And then someone, similarly kind of wraps all of this stuff together into this desperate person that insatiably looking for help, for support, for love, and they are willing to debase themselves for the sake of taking just about anyone because they're so desperate for love. How sad is that? Undeniably sad. It makes me almost cry thinking about it. And I'll tell you flat out, so few of any of these albums have elicited that amount of emotion in me listening to that than this does, which is also why I call it emo metal. Again, I genuinely hope that this is just art and not representative of somebody or somebodies that they are aware of and familiar with and referencing, because that would be very sad. I know these kinds of people exist, and I know that these issues do exist in people. And in many respects, it's possible that Issues by Korn is allowing those feelings to bubble up and come to the forefront in consciousness of those people's minds and hearts and souls. And for that reason, it resonates with them. I'm absolutely certain those people exist and connect in that way with this. And for that, I just want to give them a hug. As well, for anybody that listens to this music and is just rocking and saying, hell yeah, to this whole thing, so sad. Not to say that I'm judging, but it makes me sad that there is such a lack of depth in processing this music that we can somehow put these kinds of personalities, these perspectives on a pedestal and say, this is what strong, mentally healthy adulthood looks like. And I'm going to put that on a pedestal and honor it. And in some respects, potentially worship it. Deeply sad. So this one hits hard for me. But because of that, it speaks to how amazing this album is. It's an amazing album. Like I said, they've refined so much from Korn from 1994 to now. It's a wonderful, beautiful album that if you take that step back and just look at it as if it were a piece of art and just processing it for what it is, you might still feel those emotions of, wow, this person sounds so sad. And yet, it's still art. It's not scary, it's just art. And it's also not sad, it's just music. So if you like these 4 tracks, I had a tough time picking out the 4 that best articulated how I felt about this album as a whole. There's a lot of tracks that I left off that are also super mega hits or dive into other issues. So if you want to go on that journey with Korn, feel free to do so. If you haven't listened to this album before and you're really interested in diving into the lyrics, a la what I've been talking about here, pace yourself. Because this is not an easy album to listen to because of just how well Korn articulates some of these mentally unhealthy perspectives. And I would just encourage you to listen to one, process it a little bit, maybe listen to another, and then process it. If you just run right through and just skate across the top, you might miss some stuff and not appreciate it as much as Korn was hoping you might. So pace yourself, but enjoy it because it is truly one of the greatest metal albums of the decade. So next is Masashi Hamauzu, and the album is the Saga Frontier 2 original soundtrack. This is 3rd gen video game music. As I said at the very beginning, there was going to be one beautiful example of video game music this year, and it's this. So you might remember Saga Frontier from when we talked in 1997 about the Saga Frontier 1 original soundtrack, which was done by Kenji Ito. This is done by somebody else, so this is the first Saga album of any kind that is done by somebody other than Kenji Ito, and it's Masashi Hamauzu, and it is a triumph. So I'm going to go into a very small amount of detail about this game and the album just to help paint the picture a little bit, but I'm not going to go too far into it because I just want you to experience the music. So first of all, this game itself, much like all the other Saga games, has a different dynamic to it in which it's not just you having a set number of characters and moving forward. In this case, you only could choose between 2 characters, and it's a multi-generational experience in which one of the characters, you'll go on a journey with them, they'll have a family, retire, their kid will take over, they'll retire, their kid will take over. And so it's a multi-generational adventure, which is new and different and exciting and interesting. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece is that this is set in a pseudo-German medieval fantasy realm. So a lot of the music has classical German influences. So putting that frame of reference aside, the task that Masashi Hamauzu had is to create, first of all, a beautiful sweeping soundtrack, much like any role-playing game composer from any generation of video games, that is very much in line with German classical music because the way that the story goes, it should match up with the music, right? And that the music itself should evolve over time to match the generational evolution of characters through the macro arc of the game. And then finally, too, that he needed to create a soundtrack where some of the music that you hear in the beginning of the game, so at the very beginning, the first generation of the characters, sounds new and interesting at that moment, but as the game goes on and you revisit some of those places and those moments, becomes nostalgic in a way, where you're several generations on in the story, but you're going back to old places, and so you hear those same songs over again, and rather than them being new and interesting, the music at a macro level has evolved so much, has changed, like going through multiple iterations of alternative rock, that by the time you're going back to some of those old places that you visited in the first wave of this game, it sounds retro. So he had to create multiple waves of the same ideas across one soundtrack and do it through the German medieval classical music style. Like there was a lot that was on his plate in order to make this happen. So all of that frame of reference is critically important to talking about why, first of all, Masashi Hamauzu has created a triumph of an album here. Because of how he managed to do all of that at the same time, I have no idea how he managed to do that. So leaving all that aside, now I'll actually talk about the tracks that I am giving you. And the reason that I'm giving you these 4 tracks is because it articulates in the clearest possible way how the music evolved across generations and where he took the music. And you could just extrapolate that the evolutions between each of these tracks you can put to all the rest of the music that you experience over the course of the game. Because the entire soundtrack, for the most part, is a beautiful orchestral album that is, in its own way, a peak of video game music, at least by my estimation. So the 4 tracks I'm going to give you are the 4 battle themes from the game that evolve depending on which generation of the characters you're being part of. So the battle music track itself is called Feldschlacht, because it means field battle, because all the tracks in this album have German names to them. So it's Feldschlacht 1, 2, 3, and 4. I would encourage you to basically just listen to them right up against each other, one after another, and hear how the same original idea evolves and evolves and evolves and evolves until it gets to its 4th iteration, and it sounds next to nothing like that first iteration. And where the first iteration sounded interesting and intriguing and engaging in its own way when you're first listening to it, as you get further and further away from it, it sounds rudimentary and nostalgic in a way. The thing I would also say too about these battle themes is that considering this is supposed to be a German medieval fantasy that is mostly orchestral, coming up with a battle theme in any respect for something like this must have been incredibly challenging. So that Masashi Hamauzu came up with one concept that he was going to circle all of the 4 iterations around and make it still sound orchestral and have that German influence to it, but also is a battle theme like any other battle theme in any role-playing game. Again, I have no idea how he managed to do it, but triumph nonetheless. So this is a really long album. If you're interested in listening to anything but these 4 tracks, almost everything in this album is beautifully crafted. There's almost no wasted motion or wasted space in this album. Even the minor moments or opportunities to play music, like when you're deciding which saved game you want to pick between the current one or one that you had beforehand, he throws amazing music into even that. So he tried really, really hard on this album, and as a result, I would give those 4 tracks your time, and if you want to go back and listen to more of the soundtrack, I don't really think you need to know more about the game other than what I've already told you to appreciate it. It's a triumph, so give it your time. So next is Mos Def, Black on Both Sides. Mos Def, you might recall, one half of Black Star. This is second wave alt rap and also neo golden age of rap. The tracks I'll give you: Fear Not of Men, Hip Hop, Do It Now, which he did with Busta Rhymes, and Mathematics, which Mathematics in this case, one might think since it's alt rap that we're talking about Nation of Islam, we're not really. It's maybe 3 to 5%. It's mostly the mathematics of systemic racism, just frame of reference. What I love most about this album at a macro level is that the critiques that Mos Def is putting forward here are very refreshing. They are certainly talking about Black empowerment, the Black community as a whole, what Black folks can do in order to step forward, stand up, and reclaim their power. And I love all of that for Mos Def. But taking it one step further, it's just so clear how he's telling some of these stories about hitting those topics in new, different, interesting ways that may very well be relevant for the coming millennium, who can say? But he just tackles them in such thoughtful, intricate, detailed ways. And he weaves this a little bit throughout a lot of these tracks, but talking about how the rap game, as it is called in this moment, is essentially a new jail cell for a lot of Black artists. That, as I've been saying with the whole empire rap idea, and that's just in many ways rappers that are at the head of the rap genre, that they themselves are Black, taking some corporate ownership over the sound that they have all created. And so it's creating some of that power in the genre and taking that ownership. But also, obviously, there's a lot of other production companies out there that are not Black owned or people of color owned that have been exploiting the rap culture for, at this point, almost 20 years. And so that he has this critique where rap potentially in the past used to be this empowering creative outlet to let other people know outside of the Black community what is going on, to potentially create movements, is now just another form of a jail. And that sort of mindset is really amazing to me. And I feel heartened in the fact that it is, in one way or another, spotlighting my critique on the empire rap movement, because it is not escaping the critique and the criticism from Mos Def on this album. It's very much there too, so I really like that. And two, the systemic racism, where I think that previously in gangster rap or maybe even in alt rap, there has been much more of a low level or closer to the issue discussion about systemic racism, or maybe one piece of it. Mos Def is pulling it up to that macro level and talking about how it's not just one issue and one issue and one issue and one issue. It is a whole system that has existed since even before the beginning of the United States, and way before that too, in which systemic racism has been actively keeping populations down in favor of others. And again, with a track like Mathematics, he just lays it out for you clear cut and said, this is what this is how much money it is how much it costs to do this is the comparison, and this is how it's holding us down. It's very, very clear cut. I think in one way or another, it's nice that Mos Def was not being as poetic about it and just being more overt and putting it in your face, which to me speaks to that neo-golden age of rap, where we're not being so evasive and poetic and metaphorical about it all. We're just telling you what's going on, a la The Message by Grandmaster Flash and the Furious Five. So these 4 tracks are amazing. The rest of this album is amazing too. I mean, Black on Both Sides by Mos Def is pretty fundamental in the history of rap music. So if you haven't listened to it ever, or you haven't listened to it for a while, give it another listen based upon the context of this little journey that we're going on right here. Because I would like to believe that you might hear a couple different ways of issues being framed that could be a little bit different and interesting and refreshing for you, if, as we've been getting bogged down in the first and second wave of alt rap up until this moment as well, gangster rap has been really ruling that conversation for a little while, and obviously empire rap doesn't touch it nearly at all, and if they do, it's purely from a pandering standpoint, unfortunately. So Mos Def, as they say, trying to keep it real, and he's doing a really good job. So next is Of Montreal, The Gay Parade. This is indie pop and retro psychedelic pop. The tracks I'll give you: Old Familiar Way, Fun Loving Nun, The March of the Gay Parade, and Neat Little Domestic Life. So like I said earlier at the beginning of this episode, around the pop section, retro psychedelic pop is starting to find its way into indie pop. Of Montreal is really well known for bringing old style psychedelic pop into the mix and infusing it into other different ideas around indie pop, and we put it in this big food ball that's called indie pop. There's a lot more going on here than just those two ideas, but the retro psychedelic pop is the thing that's kind of carrying a lot of this forward. That's, at least for the Gay Parade, that's their vibe, 100%. The thing I'll say too, though, is that we're finally finding somebody that's evolving off of Weezer's Blue album from ages ago, because most of these tracks that I'm giving you, other than Old Familiar Way, sound like we're taking Blue album ideas, which were legitimately more fourth wave alt rock and early indie rock, and softening them up and then moving them into these new directions. So that it took so many years in order for anybody to meaningfully figure out a way to mobilize those ideas and push them forward with quality, surprising to me. But I'm glad that somebody got there. It's great. So if you like these 4 tracks, the rest of the album is about like this for the most part. It does do the retro psychedelic thing almost throughout the whole thing. Of Montreal is really great. They're going to be great for the next several years. So give them your time now because this is an early example from them. And there's far more to come. So next is Porcupine Tree, Stupid Dream. This is newer wave, neo soft rock, and neo Brit rock. Not second wave neo Brit rock, but just neo Brit rock. The tracks I'll give you: Even Less, Piano Lessons, Pure Narcotic, and Don't Hate Me. So the reason that I gave you those 3 genres to help ground you is that Porcupine Tree is going in many different directions all at once, pulling in a lot of old stuff, a lot of new stuff. We're getting into the Police again a little bit, which is why I'm calling it newer wave as opposed to retro new wave, because this is actually taking things in a newer direction than what American football is doing. That sounds more retro Police. This sounds like we're taking the Police and moving them in a current direction. And also neo soft rock. So we talked for maybe 2 entire seconds in the 80s about soft rock. You can think about Phil Collins, for example, or even the Police or Sting when he was just doing his solo thing. A lot of that was soft rock. This is taking that and moving it into new indie rock directions. Also, there's a neo Brit rock component to it too that is more like Oasis and less like something that's newer and moving even further forward. So just thinking about that. I really like this album because it is so aggressively playing in the retro space and trying desperately to pull all this retro stuff forward and do something new and interesting with it. I love that for them. And I also believe that albums like this are giving other artists some directionality on how to use more of the newer wave ideas or neo soft rock ideas and doing even more with them and figuring out how do we merge those into indie rock even more so that we're experimenting even more. So I'd like to believe that Porcupine Tree Stupid Dream is one of the most innovative albums of the year just because of how much they're playing with those fusions and setting up future artists to play with it even more. So it's really great stuff. If you like these 4 tracks, it's about all like this on that newer wave neo soft rock side. So if you've been missing that sound for 18 to 20 years, you can listen to this because it's basically that vibe, except it's got the indie rock turned up a little bit. So give it your time. So next is the Red Hot Chili Peppers, Californication. This is rap metal as they've always been and have always espoused and basically ushered in, and pop music, just straight ahead pop music. So the tracks I'll give you, which might be debatable depending on who you're talking to: Around the World, Get on Top, Easily, and Emmett Remus. So there are several other hits on this album like Scar Tissue that I did not put on here because I found that some of these other tracks got to the point a little bit more clearly or first. And so it wasn't necessary for me to just put hit tracks on here that kind of prove the same point over and over and over again. I'd like to believe these 4 tracks are at once the most ambitious tracks on the album, and they're of the greatest variety that gives you the greatest overall sense of where the whole record goes. So this is to say, too, if you really like these 4 tracks, there's a lot more hits that are on this record, so go listen to the whole thing if you really want to. So with Californication, Red Hot Chili Peppers has considerably softened their sound from the several albums that they've had up until this moment, because Blood Sugar Sex Magik from many years ago was not their first, and it was just their most popular up until that moment. But even from then, they've really softened their ideas, their image, their sound, their perspective to create greater generalizability, greater relatability with a wider audience. So good for them. The thing is, too, that as a result, the perspective on this album is starting to get a little bit muddled compared to Blood Sugar Sex Magik, because I think they were better embodying the sexy rock god ideas in that album much more so than they are here. I think that the topics that they're talking about here are a little bit more obscure. They're a little harder to get your hands all the way around because sometimes it goes into that direction of being mysterious poetry, or at least it seems that way. And so because of that, the messages that might have come across as a counterculture band being the Red Hot Chili Peppers from the 80s or even up until Blood Sugar Sex Magik, that's being kind of buffed out of them, unfortunately or fortunately. It made them a lot of money, so it can't possibly be that bad for them. Having said that, though, the confidence still comes across. It's very clear. I definitely get the charisma coming out of the band and all these tracks that I gave you and the other ones that we didn't talk about. So, despite the fact that the perspective is getting a little bit muddled and a little bit more homogenous, and the counterculture pieces have really been shaved down to be more accessible to a wider audience, the confidence is still there. So, because of that, give Californication your time, because it is a really wildly popular pop album. For 1999, it's kind of a milestone moment on the radio for young people at the time. So, it's very much in the zeitgeist of that moment. So, give it your time. So next is Royal Trucks, again, Veterans of Disorder. This is fourth wave alt-rock, neo-arena hair metal, and post-punk. So it's all of those things, which should say to you that they are pretty well out in front still of what's going on in the world of rock music right now, because they're tackling arena and hair metal much more so than other people are. We're on the way to garage. This is very pre-garage rock. This sounds like where in their last album, Accelerator, they were still living in that fourth wave alt rock, playing with hair metal ideas. But this sounds even closer to what White Stripes sounds like. This is getting very, very, very close. So because of that, they are out in front of almost everybody right now. The tracks I'll give you: Water Park, Stop, Second Skin, and Witch's Tit. So the first thing I'll say, beyond that this is so very close to being garage rock, we might as well just start calling it that. I think if somebody else comes out with another album that moves maybe 1 inch further, it's just going to be garage rock at this point. So we're basically there. So beyond that, I perceive that every single track on this album is some manner of a triumph. In just 1 year's time, despite the fact that Accelerator was amazing also, they've refined so much, they've focused so much, the confidence is turned way up from even Accelerator was. They know exactly what they're doing and where they're going, and they understand their sound so well. And they're just delivering with such expertise. It's amazing. Because you could take that step back and listen to any of these 4 tracks and say, gosh, this just sounds like a total mess of rock music sounds. And yeah, that's the point. But also, their perspective is so clear now, where I would even encourage you to go back and listen to the tracks I recommended from Accelerator from 1998 and listen to these tracks. The refinement is clear. And like I said, they're throwing much more post-punk ideas into it, which is why we call it post-punk. The arena rock is much more in there than it was last year, where I think it was more just hair metal, and now it's arena rock and hair metal put together. So they're just living in their retro 80s rock moment. And the fourth wave alt rock is the glue that holds it all together. It's really amazing what they're doing. And so, little frame of reference for me. When I was doing the project the first time, didn't regard Royal Trucks at all. Didn't even know who they were, didn't add them to the list. I had no wherewithal for them. When I did it the second time, I didn't know necessarily who they were, but I knew that, me being a huge fan of High Fidelity, the book and the movie, that Royal Trucks is regarded and referenced at the end of the movie by the self-defined music aficionados as being really, really, really good for the moment. And when I first saw that movie when I was, a teenager, I didn't understand Royal Trucks at all. I didn't understand the perspective. I had no idea. It just sounded like wailing guitar, wailing music playing, and their vocal affectations didn't resonate with me. So I knew all of that going into Royal Trucks when I was doing the second iteration of the project. But then, as I really intensively listened to Accelerator as part of the podcast and then listened to Veterans of Disorder, it really hit home for me just how good and competent this music is. And they're so confident in knowing exactly what they want to do. Comparatively, this makes Death Cab seem clueless. Like, they really know what they're doing and where they want to go. And for that, I honor them endlessly, because not that as I've gone through the project, I've been a huge fan of garage rock. I look forward to exploring that in greater depth and maybe getting more on board with it than I have historically. I've never been a huge fan of the White Stripes, but I'd like to believe that Royal Trucks is getting me there, and I will be ready for it once we get to that moment, because what they're doing, I so very clearly acknowledge now as being high quality rock music and so forward leaning for the greater genre as a whole. So I honor them. And hopefully, as you listen to these 4 tracks, you honor them similarly. And if you don't, because this isn't your vibe, that's entirely fine. Just because I'm getting on the train doesn't mean that you have to also. That's not how this works. I encourage you to have your own perspective. It's not scary. It's just a differing opinion. So because of that, give these 4 tracks your time. If you like where it's going, great. Veterans of Disorder's a fundamental album for the world of rock music. So give it your time. It's really great. And if it isn't for you, then just, move along. So next is Shannon Wright, Flight Safety. This is folk and indie pop, but also second wave shoegaze and also post-punk to a certain extent. The tracks that I'll give you are Floor Pile, All These Things, and You're the Cup, as if to say you are the cup. So beyond what I just said about Royal Trucks and Veterans of Disorder around the post-punk thing, it's interesting to me that also other artists, even coming at it from the indie pop or folk pop side or even the shoegaze side, are starting to think about different ways to use post-punk from the early 80s too. It's interesting that those retro ideas that might not have fit at that point in the past, especially because of potentially how purist some of those punk bands might have been at that point in time, to stretch out and collaborate and merge ideas together to create these new different things at that time, because they were so fixated on it has to be punk, it has to be this way and do it this way, that now that we're 18 to 20 years away from it, there's a lot more comfort in just plucking some ideas from these different records and trying to shove it into these different spaces that previously those artists that were doing it in its pure form might have been too averse to, or too much of a zealot to do. Who can say? So that Shannon Wright is playing with those ideas is fantastic. I would also say beyond that, that she is hitting all the right genre notes and artifacts all at the same time. So the folk and indie pop, you can tease it out very clearly. The shoegaze and its next iteration into that second wave, you can tease out both of them intermixing with one another to create that dynamic shoegaze experience and that slowcore experience. You can hear the post-punk in all of its different facets. You can hear the hopelessness of Unknown Pleasures by Joy Division. You can hear the Fang. You can hear the early iteration of Social Distortion. You can hear Dead Kennedys. You can hear Violent Femmes. You can hear all of that happening all at the same time, and it's weaving together into this highly dense, complex tapestry. And in her case, she's using folk and indie pop as the glue rather than fourth wave alt rock as the glue. So she's using folk and indie pop as the glue to pull all these ideas together, and it's working beautifully. You can really, really tease it out. And this isn't just me as a seasoned listener being able to hear this 2-note run and knowing exactly where it's referencing. Even people that have just been casually listening to this podcast, casually listening to some of these tracks as we're going along these episodes, should be able to hear those distinctive things popping out every couple seconds or so. And just saying, oh, yep, I can hear that, and I can hear that, and that, and that, and I hear where she's going with that. And it's amazing. Now, the beautiful thing about this too, being a complex tapestry, is that it doesn't seem all like one thing, like Nirvana's Nevermind or OK Computer. It seems like you could pick out all the different things, which in a way is fun from a folk perspective, because so much of folk is about referencing the past and where we've come from, both in terms of music and society and culture. And considering that she's using folk and indie pop as the glue, you can reference back all of those things in the past and get a little bit nostalgic hearing these things. It's really, really interesting stuff. Shannon Wright did a really, really great job here. I had no idea who she was prior to this project, nor this podcast, so I'm putting her on a pedestal in this regard because she did a really great job, in particular, too, pulling together basically everything that's happened through the entirety of the 90s and doing it impeccably. Like, she did the shoegaze, she did the folk and indie pop, she did the post-punk ideas of right now. She pulled it all together. So, great capstone example for the end of the decade. So next is Spearmint, A Week Away. This is second wave neo-Brit rock and newer wave. The tracks I'll give you: A Week Away the track, Sweeping the Nation, We're Going Out, and A Trip into Space. This to me seems like we're very much leaning out of the 90s and leaning into the 2000s. Even the album cover itself looks very 2000s-esque, which makes me excited because it feels like we're going in the 2000s directions, and I'm starting to get geared up for the next season, get geared up for 2000 and what comes forward. And the sound too, it really sounds like we're getting into those early 2000s sounds, and I love that. The newer wave, I did not realize at the moment, was that idea that moves us forward and starts to take us in that direction, so I love that. This is a really interesting pivot from Oasis, in which we're infusing more new wave or retro new wave, new wave, newer wave ideas into what Oasis was doing to soften it up a little bit. Interestingly enough, it's got a little mod going in there. It's got a little disco going in there, all of which is feeding from new wave, because mod was a good retro idea that fed into new wave, and then new wave was itself. Disco was also running parallel to much of new wave. And so Spearmint is taking what new wave was referencing as a retro idea, the idea itself, and disco, which was running alongside it, and bringing all of that stuff together, combining it with what Oasis was doing a couple of years ago, and making something deeper and more interesting. And like I said, if you really don't think about any of that stuff and just put it aside, if you were listening to music in the 2000s, this is a little bit what it sounded like. So Spearmint is doing an excellent job mobilizing so many retro and current ideas together to take us into the future which is exactly the reason why it's on this list. It is a harbinger of what is to come for the 2000s. So if you like these 4 tracks, they do go about in the same direction, fluctuating in terms of how much they're infusing first wave neo-Brit rock, second wave. And second wave in this case is, like I said, taking all of those newer wave ideas and shoving them into the Oasis model. So sometimes it's a little bit more straight ahead sounding like Oasis. Sometimes they're leaning into more adventurous territory, taking all those retro ideas and sounding more 2000s-esque. So give the rest a listen, because this is another one of those very fun, listenable albums that you could really just sit down and enjoy. So next is The Chicks, again, Fly. This is, once again, third wave neo-traditionalist country. The tracks I'll give you: Ready to Run, Cowboy Take Me Away, and Sin Wagon. It's funny, I think all 3 of these track names are so archetypal of neo-traditionalist country in any wave. It's funny because Ready to Run just gives me that image of running out of the farmhouse and running through the cornfield and I'm going to go be my own person. And Cowboy Take Me Away is that Southern traditions fantasy of the strong silent type cowboy taking me to a new special place because I already ran away and I ran into the arms of a cowboy. And then Sin Wagon, well, you could put the pieces together. It's a fun little journey that they take you on. And the fact that the album name is called Fly, it just paints this full-on picture for you. It's really fun stuff. Ready to Run is, I think, the best articulation of what I'm about to say, which is that they even more so now are merging even more traditional music and string band music artifacts into this even newer package. I think that they've evolved and gotten even more confident from the likely accolades and attention and love that they got from their last album. They're just going even harder now, where they're bringing in Celtic traditions, which is basically the origins of American traditional string band music, and obviously African components to it, but mostly the Celtic style. And they're bringing in more old time rock and roll aspects. They're bringing in more bluegrass than they ever have before, more string instruments on the whole. They're just creating this whole kingdom of the neo-traditionalist country idea of pulling in everything from the past, everything that's current, bringing in pop hooks and conventions, and creating just this wonderful monument to this existing wave of neo-traditionalist country. Like I've said over the last couple of years, I'm sad that all this really great work that we're putting into making neo-traditionalist country evolve into and firmly establish itself as this new, interesting, great thing where we're honoring the past much more so than we ever have before and infusing all these current ideas into it to make it even more relatable to a wider audience, that things are going to take a really interesting pivot over the next couple of years is unfortunate. I'd like to believe that we're not going to abandon all of this great work that we're putting in right now, or that the progress that the Chicks are putting forward altogether. But I guess it remains to be seen, and we'll go on that journey and determine just how stunted the movement of country music gets and for how long before it emerges into its next thing. I genuinely hope that once we're done with the Chicks, it doesn't get quiet again until we get to Fearless by Taylor Swift, because that would be sad. But I don't know yet. I don't remember, legitimately. So if you really like these 4 tracks, it's one of your last great chances to get into some third wave neo-traditionalist country before things start to get quiet and weird again. So because of that, give this album your time, because it's an even better example of how the Chicks are just, as they say, flying. They're just flying. It's a really wonderful album, and it highlights their skill and exactly where I ideally would love to see neo-traditionalist country go going forward. So next is the Get Up Kids, Something to Write Home About. This is second wave pop punk, like we talked about at the very beginning of the episode, and what I'm calling indie punk, but that's a highly debatable tag. It's mostly second wave pop punk. The 2 tracks I'll give you: Holiday, which is a huge hit for them, and Red Letter Day. So as I said at the beginning of this episode, second wave pop punk, and this album specifically, is evolving off of Blink-182. They've basically stripped out almost everything that was neo-punk about Dude Ranch by Blink-182, and you get this. It's still punk music at its core, and it's not rock and roll infused like Dookie was by Green Day. This is something different. But does it hardly sound like punk music anymore? No. Just a little teeny tiny bit where we were talking about, oh yeah, there's a 60-40 split between pop punk and neo-punk with Blink-182 or some approximation of that. This is 80% pop and 20% punk. So you can expect that maybe as we go along here and other pop punk artists and bands move forward and emerge, they might go back a little bit and rediscover some of those original punk elements and make it a little bit more punky than it has been. But this is probably one of the least punk albums that we've had so far since the Go-Go's, and it's still being defined as punk. And I say the Go-Go's too, because where we defined the first album by Madonna to be a little bit pop punk, that's even like 95% pop and 5% punk. Like there was a thin veneer of punk on it that gave it some intrigue. This has a little bit more than that. You could still detect some of the punk, much in like they sound similar to Blink-182. But other than that, it's mostly just pop music or even indie pop music. So that's why I called it indie punk to a certain extent, but there it is. If you like these two tracks, it's about all like this. I think Holiday is their major hit, and it stands out as a track by itself among the rest of the album. Red Letter Day to me is the best example of where the rest of the album goes. So if you like Holiday, that's great. You're in a very large community of people that like that track. If you like Red Letter Day though, you might want to listen to the rest of the record because Red Letter Day is better representative of the rest of the album as a whole, which is good. But if very, very pop punk is not necessarily your thing, this might not be your thing. But like I said, if you like Red Letter Day, give it a shot. And finally is Wilco, Summer Teeth. This is alt country, certainly. Third wave alt rock, so not fourth wave alt rock, but third wave alt rock. So we're going back a wave. And then indie rock, obviously. So the thing is, right, that when we say third wave alt rock, a la Pavement, and indie rock together, you can kind of imagine where we're going, which is probably the second or third Pavement album where they're really dancing the line between the two. And then the alt country component, which we've been talking about for a few years already, where it gets ever closer to just being indie rock, but it still's got a couple country flavors to it that, you know, either in the topics that they're singing about or the instruments that they're using or the tone of their voice can all hint at being more country than indie rock in this case. So Wilco plays with that line pretty consistently across the whole album. The tracks I'll give you, which I think are pretty debatable because this is a huge, huge, huge record for them. It's a huge record for the entirety of indie rock as a whole, are Can't Stand It, She's a Jar, as in she is a jar, not a jar as in open, but she is like a jar, like a mason jar, A Shot in the Arm, and How to Fight Loneliness. How to Fight Loneliness seems like just a perfect title for something that is third wave alt rock, indie rock, and alt country at the same time. So kudos to Wilco on just getting that title exactly right. Like I said before, they've pulled together so much here, and they're turning up the levels of indie rock, third wave alt rock, alt country to varying degrees and levels in each of these tracks that gives you something a little bit different every single time you listen to each of these tracks. But it does sound like one cohesive idea. Summer Teeth is a really fantastic album. It's a pinnacle for them in many respects. I'm really happy that we get the chance to talk about it in this decade versus maybe as we get to the 2000s, it would have gotten lost in the shuffle a little bit. This is the perfect time for Summer Teeth to come out, and kudos to Wilco to have that Nostradamus-like insight to bring it out in 1999 versus 2000. But it was a really great moment for the history of indie rock and alt country. Like I said, this is a really great way to capstone the entire experience of the alt country trajectory in the 90s and also the indie rock trajectory in the 90s, because this brings together all of those things so well and so impeccably and so confidently. It just tells that great story. So again, thanks Wilco for helping me out with this podcast to make it happen for me. So really beyond that, if you like these 4 tracks, there's not much more that I find it necessary to talk about regarding Summer Teeth because it is such a popular album in the history of indie rock music. If you like these 4, the whole album is basically like this. It's a real end-to-end sort of album, and I would encourage you to go listen to it just because of how successfully they've figured out how to refine their model from 1996 when we did the conspicuous absence of their album being there. They have refined so much more. So like I said in 1996, just to remind you, I didn't think at that time that they were moving anywhere new necessarily, and I perceived that in 1999, they and then also other artists have moved forward enough where at least they seem to have a better understanding of where all of these genres can fit together as puzzle pieces to make a complex record. I also think that they increase the level of confidence they have in playing alt country, indie rock, third wave alt rock, that they could better fuse it all together in different capacities to make all these different interesting tracks. So I think their confidence went up, but then I think also the music scene evolved too to give them further paths forward on how to make Summer Teeth become a reality. So it took a village and then also their skill put together, but I'm so glad that they made it there. And hopefully you can enjoy this record as much as I did. So next, let's move into our conspicuous absences for this year and why. So first is Poly6, first P, ADSRM with an exclamation point. This is Japanese in case you weren't familiar with Poly6. So this is specifically neo-synth rock. So you might actually be asking yourself, SJ, what is neo-synth rock? Because we didn't really talk about that so much. Well, if you want to take the ideas that we were experiencing with Yellow Magic Orchestra, so those synth ideas that they were playing with back in 1979, 1978, 1980, those, so that synth component. Neo, we're moving it forward, it's current stuff. And then rock, it's not exactly pop, so it's not neo-synth pop like you would think about for 1981, the Buggles. It's not exactly that. It's definitely more on the rock side. So it's a very avant rock, avant electronica experience. It's very interesting and very ambitious too. However, considering that it is very avant-garde, the expectation around artists that are doing more avant-garde stuff, more forward-leaning ideas that are really out on the frontiers trying to figure some new interesting ideas out, you got to be able to tighten up your perspectives a little bit so that they're coming across clearly and confidently. And although Poly6 is going into uncharted territory a little bit as far as what artists they're pulling from in the retro side and what they're referencing in today's conceptions with how forward-leaning their synth ideas are or their rock ideas, it's not tight enough just yet. I'm sure that as we move along, they will get tightened up, but at least for right now, the perspective isn't clear enough. They're still experimenting with too many ideas in front of us rather than cooking it a little bit more behind the curtain and then presenting a little bit more of a polished product. So that's why it's conspicuous absence. It's ambitious and experimental, but it needs more time. So next is Sigur Rós Augetis Byrjun. This is space rock and ambient to a certain extent. So this album is very beautiful and very haunting, but it is a little meandering too and not tight in any respect. I think that a lot of these tracks go on way longer than they need to, which is to say this is ambient music to a certain extent and space rock. So if you're flying out in the middle of space, time means little, so I get that. But if we're sitting here and we're listening to this music and we're not necessarily just interested in going on an ambient journey, there are probably places that they could have edited down to get more to the point of their vision a little bit faster. But I think that that's also in one or more ways a nitpick. It's a conspicuous absence because of how wonderful the album is. But again, kind of the problem with Poly6, they probably could have edited a little bit more to get more to the point of some of these tracks more effectively. I'm hopeful that there's more Sigur Rós down the line for us to potentially consider and put on the essentials. But at least for this one, I think that they have opportunities to refine. So next is The Flaming Lips, The Soft Bulletin. This is third wave alt rock. So again, third wave, not fourth wave, and avant rock, and probably neo psychedelic rock to a certain extent, and probably indie rock to a certain extent. So despite the fact that I love this album personally, which can happen, and it is one of their wildly famous albums, The Soft Bulletin, it's one of their most highly regarded albums of all time, other than what I think comes next after this album for them, which we may also talk about, is that this, weirdly enough, sounds both too early and too late in the genre trends of time. What do I mean by that? I mean that some of the ideas that are being played with that are more on the avant rock side, like the retro ideas that they're playing with on the avant rock side, sound like they're from maybe 1988, 87. So not quite time yet to be playing with those ideas. They sound a little bit still passé versus being forward-leaning and retro. So because of that, that's where they're a little too early on some things. That they're playing with some ideas that haven't marinated enough to bubble back up to being in that 18 to 20 range. I'm not saying necessarily that I'm averse to it just because it doesn't follow my personal rule. It's just that for some of these ideas and sounds, it sounds more passé than it sounds hyper forward-leaning or hyper avant-garde. So because of that, that's where it's too early. Where it's too late is that they're playing with mostly third wave alt rock ideas as the glue holding it all together. And where Royal Trux is out there in front rocking with fourth wave on the way to garage rock, this sounds like it's been way left behind. So because of that, the time frame of this album seems to be sitting somewhere between 1987 and 1994, maybe even 1993. So considering that we're in 1999, it's living in the wrong moment. And that sucks for me to say, because like I said, I love this album. Race for the Prize is one of my favorite tracks of the decade. And It's sad for me to say that, but I'm going to be totally honest with you when I hear it, that this just sounds like it's the bubble that this music encapsulates seems to be the wrong moment for 1999. So at a macro level, sad to say, but it's a conspicuous absence. And then finally, the Roots, Things Fall Apart. This is Empire Rap and retro MCing. So this might be disappointing to a lot of people, especially those that have been following the rap journey across this podcast this whole time and thinking, why are the Roots not on the essentials? You had space to put it on there. Why didn't you put it on there? Why is it even a conspicuous absence? Why are you doing this to me? And the reason is that although there's a lot of things going on here in this album, because there are, the Roots / Questlove have a lot of things going on here in this record, and I completely and utterly honor that. Like, there are some alt rap things going on, but this is mostly just Empire Rap, because the depth with which they're talking about things, rapping about things, compare this up to Black on Both Sides by Mos Def. Things Fall Apart seems a lot less deep in its critiques. And maybe it's just because I'm sliding across the top of it, and maybe I really do need to aggressively sit down and read the lyrics and the liner notes as I'm processing what's being said. But Mos Def does it without me having to do that, and he does it impeccably. This doesn't do that nearly as well. And to that end also, in the Empire Rap, alt rap, retro MCing, retro golden age, all that stuff, they're really not pushing things very far, if at all. I think that they're mostly sitting in what the sounds that we've been engaging with the last 2, 3, 4 years, and they're not trying to push things forward. And so if they're not pushing the messaging very aggressively forward, if they're not pushing the musicality ideas forward, if the lyrics aren't calling us to meaningful action, a la Black on Both Sides, conspicuous absence. So having said that, what did you agree with? What did you disagree with? Did you disagree with what I just said about the Roots and you really do think I should have put it on the essentials? Maybe. Did you agree with what I said about Mos Def a second ago? That he was really diving in deep and he was cutting to the core with his critiques about society and systemic racism and how the rap game has basically turned into one giant machine that is just yet another prison for Black culture? Maybe. Do you disagree with what I just said about the soft bulletin and it actually is amazing and I'm totally way off in that window that I was talking about that it either accidentally or on purpose is representing? Maybe. Did you lament the fact that I didn't include Peanut Butter Wolf on any of these lists but it's sitting on my big list? Maybe. What about Ayumi Hamasaki? What do you think about IU? Do you agree that she's totally changed the face of J-pop forever? Probably. That's not a very contentious perspective. Do you continue to disagree that I call it story rap and you want me to call it something else? Great. Tell me about it. I need to hear it. What did I miss today? I think I did a pretty good job encapsulating everything that's been happening over the course of this year in one way or another. I mean, I think that I'm getting a little bit more strict in a way on what I'm putting on my essentials to a certain extent, because I really do want to make sure that everything that's on the list is essential in one way or another. But don't forget to go into my big list. The big list, it had probably more albums this year than any other year so far. And yet I still didn't manage to hit my 20. Isn't that interesting? But because of that, maybe I missed something. I talked about neoclassical metal, but I didn't end up talking about Ed Guy, who did Theater of Salvation this year. And that was the example of being neoclassical metal. Did I miss it? No, I'm referencing it right now, and it is on my big list. So if you do think that I missed something, do make sure that you go on my big list and check everything out there before you start thinking that I missed something. What did you learn today? Did you learn something about Ayumi Hamasaki? Probably, unless you're a big fan of J-pop, and then you probably knew all about her. Did you learn something about Issues by Korn? Maybe. Did you learn something about me and how I perceive music sometimes? Maybe. Did you learn something more about Royal Trucks? I hope so. They're great. Did you learn more about the Chicks? Maybe a little bit more, not too much. Or did you learn something about the Saga Frontier 2 soundtrack? Probably, because unless you were a huge video game music listener, that one was probably way under the radar for you, because it was, even as a game, it was way under the radar for most video game players. So that was pulling into kind of a deep one. So before we go, make sure that if you're interested in listening to any of the music that I reference on today's episode, check out my Essential playlist for this year. And if you're interested in listening to the rest of those albums or my conspicuous absences or any of the 100 albums that I decided to keep on my big list for this year, both my Essential list and my big list are linked in the description of this episode. Please join us again. Please make sure that you rate us and comment wherever you're listening to us. I think all of you have been doing a really great job doing that, but keep doing it because it means that we can get more people and more voices into this conversation. Make sure that you find us on Instagram at Not Scary Just Music Pod. I would love for somebody to tell me that the story rap idea is either great or not great. I literally cannot do this without you. I have to figure this one out or it's just going to bug me. So help either validate that that's a good thing to call it, or validate that it doesn't matter what we call it because none of this matters. It's just music. Or that SJ story rap is a ridiculous way to define this. We should call it this. Great. All of that's great. Tell me on Instagram. Make sure that you subscribe. We come out with episodes every other Tuesday. Also, this being the last episode before the season finale of season 2, make sure that you subscribe so that you know when season 3 starts, because it will come along eventually, and we want to make sure that you get alerted to it as soon as it comes out. Make sure to tell everybody that you know and don't know. Tell strangers, tell friends, family, everybody, because as I said a second ago, the more people we bring into this conversation, the more ears, the more voices, the better the discourse will be, the more complex the conversation will be, the more we can all connect to each other in a greater community around this music, which is just trying to connect with us and those artists trying to connect to something greater than themselves. So make sure that you tell everybody, because as we get to the end of the 90s here and we've listened to so much music so far over the course of this season, can you legitimately ask yourself the question of whether or not any of this stuff was scary? Be it Korn or Marilyn Manson or Ayumi Hamasaki. Was any of that scary? I doubt it. Because it isn't scary. It's just music. Thanks for listening, everybody.